Julian Vance just wrapped up a 3-week architectural retreat in South Beach with his mistress. Clutching a carefully chosen bouquet of champagne-colored roses, he walked up the steps of his chic West Village townhouse, carrying a light travel fatigue and a superficial, pre-rehearsed guilt. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Let me know in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. The moment he pushed the door open, his excuses were ready. It would be the usual script, an emergency with a new commercial project. His hands were tied. He had no choice but to extend the trip. However, he was not met by the weary face of his wife, worn down by postpartum depression, or the cries of his newborn son. He was met with absolute silence. Maria, the housekeeper, was in the living room, packing the last few small items into a cardboard box. Seeing him return, her eyes remained as serene as the surface of a deep lake. She spoke calmly, "Mr. Vance, you're back. Miss Eleanor and the baby moved out 2 weeks ago." Julian's heart plummeted as if from a great height. The air was sucked out of his lungs. The roses in his hand exuded a sweet fragrance that now seemed absurdly ironic. "What did you say?" He almost believed he had misheard, his brow furrowing as he adopted the unquestionable authority he used at his firm. "Where did she move? To her parents?" Maria gently shook her head, folding one last microfiber cloth and placing it neatly on her cleaning cart. "No, sir. Miss Eleanor said she found a new place. She asked me to do a deep clean of the house. After this, my work here is finished." Julian's mind went blank. Eleanor, his wife, the woman who had always been sweet, docile, and seemingly dependent on him, had left without a word while he was on a business trip, less than a month after giving birth. This was completely out of character. It felt like an absurd joke. He bolted up the stairs to the master bedroom. The walk-in closet, once overflowing with Eleanor's clothes, and her vanity, crowded with skincare products, were completely empty. Only his own custom-tailored suits and pristine shirts hung there, looking lonely and almost mocking his return. The faint scent of lavender that always surrounded his wife was gone, replaced by the sterile smell of cleaning products. He ran down the hall to the nursery. The luxurious designer crib he had personally selected was empty. The mobile above it, the decorative decals on the walls, the stacks of diapers, the organic formula in the corner, all traces of the baby were erased. The room was so immaculate, it seemed as if new life had never entered it. A nameless panic seized him. This wasn't a wife throwing a tantrum and running to her mother's. This was a total, pre-planned evacuation. He immediately pulled out his iPhone and dialed Eleanor's number. "The person you are calling is unavailable or outside the service area." Once, twice, 3 times. The result was the same. He found her parents in his contacts, straight to voicemail. In desperation, Julian ran a hand through his hair and furiously threw the bouquet of roses onto the console table in the entryway. Petals scattered across the hardwood floor. He turned to Maria, his tone harsh. "Did she leave any message? A letter?" Maria's expression remained impassive, like that of a detached observer. "Miss Eleanor only said that you would understand everything when you got back, and she asked me to give you this." She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a stack of perfectly folded printouts, and handed them to him. Julian snatched them, expecting to see a letter full of reproaches or an emotional list of grievances. But as he unfolded them, his pupils contracted. It wasn't a letter. It was a professional, meticulously detailed spreadsheet of all his personal and financial transactions. It clearly listed every expense from his personal credit card and the supplementary joint card over the past 2 months. From the booking of a luxury ocean view suite in South Beach to receipts from exclusive restaurants and a major purchase at the Cartier boutique on Madison Avenue. Date, time, place, exact amount. Every transaction was documented with surgical precision. But what made his blood run cold was the notes column on the right, written in a cold, objective tone. It included descriptions like romantic package for 2, purchase of matching diamond rings, and women's luxury handbag. Every romantic moment he had shared with Chloe Thorne on that beach had been reconstructed, tallied, and turned into irrefutable proof of his infidelity. A chill ran through his body, from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. How did Eleanor get this? He had been meticulous, using private accounts. How could she have compiled such a complete forensic audit in such a short time? This wasn't something a typical housewife could do. His eyes fell to the last line of the document. A small print footnote read, "For the attention of the judge, Mr. Vance, All of the above expenses occurred during my late-stage pregnancy and immediate postpartum recovery. I hope your inspirational retreat was productive. There was no signature, but the calm, restrained tone was unmistakably Eleanor's. Julian stared at the financial reports, his knuckles white with tension. His pride, his rationality, and his sense of control crumbled. He had always thought Eleanor was the safest place in his life, a woman who, no matter what he did on the side, could be persuaded to return with a few gentle words and an expensive gift. But the document in his hands was as precise and deadly as a scalpel, exposing his hypocritical facade with one clean cut. He had forgotten who Eleanor was before their marriage. She wasn't just a homemaker. She was a star senior auditor at one of the Big Four firms, specializing in finding the deepest corruption in seemingly perfect financial statements. For the sake of their family, she had given up her career to support his. He had grown so accustomed to her submissiveness that he had forgotten how sharp her mind could be. And now, the blade he had kept sheathed had finally been drawn. Suppressing his shock, he asked, "When did my wife start acting strangely?" Maria thought for a moment. "Probably the day after you left. Someone called Miss Eleanor. After that, she became completely silent. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just held the baby and looked at him for a very, very long time." She paused. Then she started making calls to a moving company and a lawyer. A lawyer! Julian's heart leaped. The gravity of the situation was beyond anything he could have imagined. This wasn't just a wife leaving home. This was a planned, step-by-step legal assault. He rushed into his home office, opened his MacBook, and tried to log into his online banking to check his personal and investment accounts. But after entering his password, a red warning appeared on the screen. "Your accounts have been frozen by a court-ordered temporary restraining order. Please contact your bank branch or consult your legal counsel." A court-ordered freeze. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. His real estate, his stock portfolios, his investment funds, all the wealth he had worked so hard to accumulate had, in an instant, turned into mere, unreachable numbers on a screen. Without Eleanor's consent, he couldn't move a single dollar, not even to pay for a hotel. He collapsed into his leather executive chair, experiencing true terror for the first time. He could live without Eleanor's affection, but he could not survive without the material empire on which he depended. He immediately dialed his personal lawyer, explaining the situation in one breathless rush. The lawyer on the other end listened in silence for a long time, then spoke in a grave tone. "Julian, the situation is probably worse than you think. If the opposing counsel was able to get a judge to issue a TRO without your knowledge, it means they presented extremely compelling evidence. Usually, this means the judge believes there's an imminent and significant risk that you will hide, transfer, or waste marital assets." Compelling evidence. The spreadsheet flashed through Julian's mind, but he couldn't believe a few luxury purchases could justify freezing his entire life. "Yes," the lawyer continued. "For example, proof that you were transferring large sums of money to a third party, not directly related to you, or that you were using family funds to buy property, real estate, or luxury cars for another person. Julian, have you done anything like that?" Cold sweat broke out on the hand Julian was using to grip the phone. He thought of Chloe. To make her happy, he had not only co-signed the lease on her luxury apartment in Soho, but had also given her a supplementary credit card for daily expenses. And just a month ago, he had transferred a $50,000 project bonus directly into Chloe's account under the guise of a loan. He had always believed these transactions were untraceable. At that moment, his phone screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a photograph. The background was the sterile environment of a neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. His son, the tiny life he had only seen a few times, was lying in an incubator, connected to a multitude of monitors and IV tubes. His tiny face was an alarming shade of yellow. Beneath the image was a single line of text. "While you were enjoying the sun and the beach, your son was here fighting for his life with severe hemolytic jaundice. The doctor said if I had brought him in even half a day later, he would have suffered irreversible brain damage." In that instant, all his anger, confusion, and panic were buried under an all-consuming, suffocating wave of guilt. Before his trip, Maria had mentioned that the baby looked a little yellow, but his mind had been completely focused on his tropical escape. He had simply brushed it off, saying, "Jaundice in newborns is normal. Just put him near the window to get some sun," and had dismissed the topic from his mind. He never imagined his negligence had nearly cost his son his life. He shot up, grabbed his car keys, and rushed for the door. He no longer cared about the money or the company. He just wanted to see his son. He needed to see Eleanor. He had to explain, to apologize, to fix everything. But as he reached the entrance, Maria blocked his path. She held out one final item. "Mr. Vance, Miss Eleanor asked me to give you this last piece of evidence." It was an elegant silver flash drive. Julian looked at it, feeling a sinister premonition tighten its grip on his chest. With trembling hands, he plugged it into his laptop and opened the single audio file. A voice that was familiar yet alien came through the speakers. It was Chloe's voice, full of pride, coquettishness, and provocation. "Eleanor, don't get me wrong. Julian loves you, but he needs me. You know, he's a top-tier architect. Inspiration is more important to him than his own life. And I'm the one who gives him that." She paused. "He told me living with you is like looking at a stagnant pond, calm but utterly boring. I'm the spark that makes him burn again." There was a background noise, like the clatter of a busy cafe. Julian could picture the scene with perfect clarity. Chloe sitting across from Eleanor, elegantly stirring an iced coffee, delivering these crushing words. Then, Eleanor's voice came through, so even, so devoid of emotion, that it was terrifying. "So, he asked you to come to me, to tell me to step aside?" "No, no, no," Chloe laughed softly. "Julian is very sensitive. He doesn't want to hurt you, especially now that you've just had a baby. He just hopes you'll understand. You know how men are. They need variety. I'm not trying to break up your family. I just want his company from time to time, like this trip to Miami." He said it was to find inspiration for his new design. "And you believed him?" "Yes," her tone grew more cutting. "Look at yourself. Taking care of this house, taking care of this baby that won't stop crying. What do you get? Only his superficial attention and less of his time. Meanwhile, I don't have to do anything, and I get all his passion and generosity. Just last week, he transferred $50,000 to me. Oh, he said it was pocket money. Eleanor, tell me, who do you think he really cares about?" The recording ended abruptly. Julian stood motionless, as if struck by lightning. The $50,000 he had transferred to Chloe was a dividend from one of his company's projects. He had told Eleanor the client hadn't paid the final invoice yet. He thought it was a harmless lie. He never imagined it would become the dagger Chloe would plunge into his wife's heart. But what terrified him most was that upon receiving this recording, Eleanor hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, hadn't confronted him as a normal woman would have. She showed no sign of distress. She just silently gathered the evidence, contacted the best divorce lawyers, arranged everything concerning her son, and then, just when he was at his most confident and carefree, dealt him the most devastating and lethal blow. How well did he really know this woman? Her composure, her rationality, and her resilience were like a giant net that had been slowly closing around his neck while he noticed nothing. Unable to bear it any longer, he ran out of the house like a madman, got into his Porsche, and sped toward the address of the children's hospital he found online based on the monitors in the photograph. He ran countless red lights. There was only one thought in his mind. Find her. I have to find her. Half an hour later, he burst into the waiting area of the NICU at New York Presbyterian. Through the thick glass windows, he saw her immediately. Eleanor was in a simple white button-down shirt and blue jeans. Her body, still weakened from childbirth, looked fragile, but her back was perfectly straight. She was deeply focused, talking to a doctor in a white coat, holding a small notepad and taking notes. Under the fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor, her profile looked unusually calm and firm. This was not the sweet and quiet wife he remembered. This was a completely unfamiliar woman, radiating a staggering strength. Julian ran to the glass, banging on it with his hands to get her attention. "Eleanor! Eleanor, please, listen to me!" Eleanor seemed to notice the noise and slowly turned her head. Her gaze passed through the glass and settled on Julian's frantic, desperate face. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment, not even the slightest emotion. There was only a dark, deep, unfathomable abyss. It was as if she were looking at a complete stranger who had absolutely no connection to her. She watched him silently for 2 seconds, then turned her head back, resuming her conversation with the doctor about her son's condition, as if Julian simply did not exist. This complete, absolute indifference was more desperate than the most furious argument. Julian felt all the strength leave his body. He leaned weakly against the cold wall. At that moment, his phone rang. It was his lawyer. His tone was one of extreme urgency. "Julian, it's a catastrophe. I just received a supplementary filing from the opposing counsel. Your partner, Mark Peterson, just submitted evidence to the court on behalf of the company. He's officially accusing you of embezzlement of corporate funds and breach of fiduciary duty. Embezzlement of corporate funds. Julian's head was buzzing. He couldn't process the meaning of those words. He and Mark had been friends since their student days at Columbia. They had built their architectural firm from the ground up. Over 15 years of friendship, they were practically family. How could Mark accuse him? That's impossible. Mark would never do that. Julian, calm down and listen to me, his lawyer interrupted, with a severity he had never heard before. The evidence they've presented is irrefutable. It includes bank statements showing you falsified project expenses and procurement contracts to divert company funds to your personal accounts. He paused before continuing. The largest transaction is that $50,000 you recently transferred to a certain Miss Chloe Thorne. The opposing counsel claims this money wasn't personal dividends, but funds misappropriated from a current project's budget. Julian felt as if he'd been plunged into icy water. To satisfy Chloe's growing appetite for a lavish lifestyle, he had resorted to dubious accounting tricks, using his position to alter the numbers on certain projects. He thought he had done it flawlessly, convinced that not even the company's in-house accountant could detect the breach. But he had forgotten what Eleanor did before their marriage. She was an auditor, and one of the best, specializing in uncovering the most hidden irregularities in seemingly perfect records. After their marriage, she had willingly taken a back seat to support him, and he had grown so accustomed to her apparent submissiveness that he had forgotten her brilliant mind. Now, the mind that had been dormant was back in action. But Mark would have seen those records. Why is he doing this now? Julian muttered, unable to accept his best friend's betrayal. Julian, that's the whole point, his lawyer replied in a dejected tone. My hypothesis is that your wife went to Mark first. She showed him the preliminary evidence of your embezzlement. As a partner, if Mark had known about it and failed to report it, or worse, covered it up, he would have faced criminal liability and the loss of his license. Faced with the need to save the company and his own future, he had no choice. Your wife executed a perfect move. She eliminated your last ally. The phone slipped from Julian's hand and clattered onto the hospital floor, the screen shattering. He finally understood Eleanor's plan. She didn't just want a divorce. She didn't just want to divide the assets. She was using her professional expertise to wage a precise, devastating legal war against him. First, she used the bank statements and the audio recording to prove infidelity and misappropriation of marital assets, securing a freeze on his personal wealth. She used her auditing skills to expose his corporate fraud and turn his own partner into his accuser, destroying his career and primary source of income. Every step was connected, every blow was fatal. As he stood there, a shadow of his former self, his Apple Watch vibrated. It was Chloe. Her voice was shrill, hysterical. Julian, why was my premium card declined? I was at the Louis Vuitton boutique on Madison Avenue, and the cashier said insufficient funds in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? And that $50,000 you transferred to me, I just got a call from the bank. They said the money is frozen due to a fraud investigation. What is going on? Listening to her complaints, Julian felt a deep disgust for the first time. What he had once found charming now sounded empty, superficial, and irritating. All my accounts have been frozen by court order, he replied wearily. There were a few seconds of silence, then an even shriller scream. Frozen? Then what about my rent and the things you promised me next month? Julian, you said you were a successful and powerful architect. How could you let this happen? Julian couldn't answer. I don't care. This is your problem. Fix it immediately, or we're through. The call ended abruptly. Julian looked at his shattered phone on the floor and let out a hollow, bitter laugh. There was his inspiration. The moment he was no longer able to offer her money, the only thing left burning was himself. He looked up and once again peered through the glass of the neonatal unit. Eleanor had finished her conversation with the doctor. She was standing next to the incubator, watching her son with profound tenderness. There was no trace of triumph on her face, no satisfaction, no desire for revenge. Only a serene calm, as if she had just completed a difficult but necessary task. At that moment, the work phone in his jacket pocket vibrated. He took it out. It was a new email from Eleanor's lawyer. Subject: Draft agreement regarding embezzlement case, Vance. J.D. He opened it and quickly scanned the contents. The terms were brutally simple. Eleanor would agree not to pursue additional civil claims for the misappropriation of marital property and would not seek the maximum penalty in the criminal proceedings, provided he agreed to an extremely harsh divorce settlement. He would have to cede 90% of all marital assets, including the house and all investments. His share in the architectural firm would be transferred to Eleanor at a minimally assessed value as compensation for the embezzled funds. The only things he could keep were his car and a basic bank account. Furthermore, he would have to pay maximum child support until his son turned 18. This wasn't a divorce, it was a financial execution. At the end of the email was a message relayed by Eleanor's lawyer. Mr. Vance, my client wishes to clarify that she is not acting out of revenge, but to reclaim what rightfully belongs to her and her son, including everything you took from this family and from the company you co-founded. You have 24 hours to consider. If you refuse, you will face 2 major lawsuits and up to 10 years in federal prison. Tick, tock. The analog clock on the hospital wall sounded like a death countdown, mercilessly striking at Julian's already frayed nerves. He looked up, gazing desperately at the silhouette behind the glass. He knew this was no empty threat. If Eleanor said she would do it, she would. Just then, the doors to the neonatal unit opened with a soft hiss. Eleanor walked out slowly, passing by him without even a glance. Julian lunged forward and grabbed her arm. His voice trembled with pleading. Eleanor, please, I'm begging you. Can we talk? For the sake of the child. Eleanor stopped, slowly turned her head, and for the first time, looked him directly in the eyes. Her gaze was as cold as ice. She enunciated each word with absolute clarity. Julian, when you were enjoying yourself on a beach with another woman, completely ignoring your newborn, critically ill son, you lost all right to ever use the word child in my presence again. With that, she easily pulled her arm free and continued walking toward the end of the corridor without a backward glance. Her posture was firm, unyielding. Each step crushed the remnants of Julian's heart. He watched her disappear around a corner. His legs finally gave out. He slid down the wall and collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor. In that moment, he understood that his life as he knew it was over. He thought he was only losing a wife. Now he realized he had lost his entire universe. And the architect of this destruction was himself. Sitting paralyzed on the icy hospital floor, he felt every ounce of strength leave his body. The smell of disinfectant burned his nose, making him nauseous. It was a complete, crushing defeat with no possibility of a fight. His career, his financial empire, the relationships he thought he controlled, all demolished overnight. And the person who had orchestrated it all was the wife he had always considered the weakest. The email on his phone glowed like a final ultimatum. 24 hours. He had 24 hours to decide whether to spend the rest of his life broke or in prison. He forced himself to get up from the floor, moving like a walking corpse, and staggered out of the hospital. He didn't drive home. That empty, sterile house would suffocate him even more. He didn't go to the office either. He didn't have the courage to face Mark or the employees who had once respected him. He drove aimlessly through the streets of New York. The neon lights reflected on his pale, lifeless face. He used to love this city. It was here that he had gone from a penniless student to a successful and acclaimed architect. He thought he owned this city. Now he realized he was nothing more than a defeated man about to be thrown out like trash. Without realizing it, he drove to Chloe's upscale apartment complex in Soho. He didn't know why he had come. Maybe he needed someone to talk to. Maybe he was desperately seeking some small comfort in the passion he had become addicted to. He took the elevator up and opened the door with his spare key. What he found was not Chloe's embrace, but a nearly empty living room. Several large suitcases were open on the floor. Chloe was hastily stuffing designer bags and clothes into them. Seeing him enter, she froze for a moment. A look of panic flashed across her face, quickly replaced by a cold, defensive glare. What are you looking at? You're broke. What makes you think I'd stick around to starve with you? Julian looked at her. The last illusion in his heart crumbled to dust. All the expensive gifts he had given her were now just things she was trying to take with her before fleeing. You said you loved me for who I am, not for my money, he said with a bitter laugh. Chloe didn't even look up, placing a diamond necklace into a velvet box. Yes, I did, but love doesn't pay the rent. Her tone was mocking. Julian, don't be naive. I'm a young woman in my prime. Why would I put up with a middle-aged man? I wanted a better life. You can't give me that anymore, so it's over. Her words were like poisoned daggers, striking precisely into his already broken heart. Suddenly, it all seemed absurd. For this woman, he had betrayed his wife, abandoned his son, and ruined his own career. The $50,000 I transferred to you is company money. It's dirty money. If you use it, you could be considered an accomplice, he said coldly. Chloe's hands immediately froze. Her face turned pale. She quickly took a debit card out of her handbag and threw it on the floor at his feet. Here's your card. The PIN is your birthday. I haven't touched a penny of that transfer. She cut herself off nervously. Don't ever contact me again. She slammed the suitcases shut and rushed out of the apartment, leaving him alone with the image of her retreating back. Julian was left alone in that empty, echoing space. He picked up the card from the floor and let out a quiet laugh. There was the passion he had sacrificed everything, for it came quickly and left even faster, leaving only ashes behind. His phone vibrated again. It was his lawyer. Julian, time is running out. What's your decision? If this goes to trial and the DA files formal charges, it's all over. Julian took a deep breath, gathering the last of his strength. Tell the opposing counsel that I agree. I'll sign. The moment he made the decision, he felt as if his soul had left his body. He had lost, and he accepted it. Perhaps being left with nothing was the easiest price he could pay for his arrogance and his betrayal. The next day, accompanied by his lawyer, Julian signed the humiliating divorce settlement. Watching his ink dry on the paper, he felt that the first half of his life had come to a pathetic and hypothetical end. As he walked out of the law office, the New York sun blinded him. He stood on the sidewalk, not knowing where to go. He had lost his home, his career, and his wealth. He thought of the child still in the hospital. That was his only blood, his last connection to the world. Driven by an unseen force, he drove back to the hospital. But this time, he didn't go to the neonatal unit but to the medical records department. Using an old favor from a doctor he knew, he pleaded to be allowed to see his son's medical chart. When he held the thick folder and began to flip through the pages one by one, his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The chart detailed the entire process from the child's birth to his emergency hospitalization. He read that on the third day after birth, Eleanor had noted an abnormal level of jaundice and had consulted a pediatrician. The doctor recommended observation. On the fifth day, worried, Eleanor had paid for a full blood panel for the baby out of her own pocket. The results showed dangerously high levels of hemolysis. The doctor recommended immediate hospitalization, but the pediatric ward was full. From that day on, Eleanor traveled between home and the hospital every day, holding the baby, monitoring his bilirubin levels, and waiting for a bed to become available. These were the exact days he had been in South Beach with Chloe, sipping cocktails with an ocean view. On the 10th day, the baby's condition deteriorated sharply. The jaundice level spiked to critical values. Eleanor made a decision in seconds. She signed the consent for emergency intervention and brought the child to the NICU. The attending physician's notes were clear. Patient was admitted in a timely manner. A delay of a few more hours would have led to bilirubin encephalopathy, causing irreversible neurological damage. And in the lines for the father's or guardian's signature, Eleanor's name appeared again and again. The one persistent, desperate line meant for the father remained completely blank. Julian kept turning the pages, and the tears he had been holding back finally streamed down his face. He had always believed Eleanor's revenge was driven by the pain of a cheated woman. Now he understood that the real point of no return wasn't his infidelity, but his complete indifference to his son's life. While she was running through hospital corridors alone, clinging to her child who was balancing on the edge of life and death, signing documents that could decide his fate, he was thousands of miles away, wooing another woman. This deep, gut-wrenching pain had turned her heart to stone. He staggered out of the records room, his mind in chaos. And then, at the end of the corridor, he saw her. Eleanor was holding the now discharged baby, wrapped in a soft blanket, sleeping peacefully. Eleanor looked tired, but her face radiated a new kind of peace, a serene tranquility. Julian instinctively stepped forward. He wanted to approach, to see his son, to say he was infinitely sorry. But just then, an elegant, distinguished-looking man approached her. He naturally took the baby in one arm and gently supported Eleanor's elbow with the other. Julian recognized him immediately. It was Dr. David Chen, a renowned pediatrician, a specialist, and Eleanor's former university classmate. David looked tenderly at the child, then looked up at Eleanor and said quietly, "Eleanor, the worst is over. From now on, I'll take care of you both." Eleanor looked at him and smiled. A genuine warm smile that Julian hadn't seen in years. It was a smile full of gratitude, trust, and relief, the kind of peace he had never been able to give her. In that instant, Julian froze. He felt like the biggest fool in the world. He thought this had all been Eleanor's doing, a cold, brilliant strategy executed alone. But now he understood there was a whole story behind it. He thought Eleanor had been fighting a war alone, but in her darkest moments, who was by her side? Who offered her medical support, guidance, and a shoulder to lean on? A horrifying thought began to grow in his mind. What if this perfect counterattack wasn't just Eleanor's idea? The thought wrapped around his chest like poison ivy, suffocating him. He stood motionless, watching as Eleanor and Dr. Chen walked out of the hospital together and got into a black Range Rover parked at the entrance. They moved with the harmony of a real family. Julian's mind went blank. He remembered David Chen. Back when Eleanor was in university, he had clearly been in love with her, but Julian had won her over with his persistence and the promise of a luxurious life. He thought David was a thing of the past. He never imagined that at the moment he neglected Eleanor the most, this man would return to her life as her protector. As he replayed the facts, it all started to make sense. How had Eleanor been able to so quickly identify the seriousness of the baby's jaundice and demand urgent help? Because a specialist had been advising her. How had she found the resolve to launch such a precise legal attack? Because she wasn't alone when she needed it most. Perhaps it was David who had helped her find the best divorce lawyer. A deep chill pierced Julian's body. He thought his betrayal had forced Eleanor to change. Now he understood he was just the trigger. What had truly transformed her was the solid support that held her up when she was falling. His punishment had been a perfectly prepared execution from the start. It wasn't unfair. He watched the black car disappear into traffic. He felt exiled from the world. He had lost everything he thought was his. And Eleanor, after leaving him, had clearly found something better. The following days were a true purgatory for Julian. He moved from the multi-million-dollar townhouse that symbolized his success to a tiny studio in Yonkers. Thanks to his concession of his shares and the return of the funds, Mark decided not to press criminal charges for embezzlement. But his reputation in the New York architecture world was completely destroyed. No self-respecting firm wanted anything to do with him. He was forced to sell his Porsche and survived on the few savings he had left. He tried to take on independent projects, but the wealthy clients who used to admire him now avoided him. He had fallen from the very top into the mud and learned the true taste of human indifference. Chloe disappeared without a trace. His friends stopped answering his calls. He began to suffer from chronic insomnia. His mind replayed memories over and over. He remembered seeing Eleanor for the first time in a white blouse, quietly reading in the library. He remembered her eyes full of tears at their wedding. He remembered a pregnant Eleanor making him something to eat in the kitchen late at night. These moments, which he used to think were simple, even boring, were now priceless memories he could never get back. He finally understood that what he had destroyed wasn't something trivial. It was the most valuable thing he had. He began to miss his son with a physical ache, that little life he had barely held in his arms. According to the divorce agreement, he paid his child support punctually every month, but he had no idea how the boy was doing. Was he growing well? Was he smiling yet? A few times. He drove to the neighborhood where Eleanor's parents lived, parked at a distance, hoping to catch even a glimpse of him, but he never succeeded. Eleanor seemed to anticipate his every move, keeping the child completely out of his reach. Until one day, 3 months later, he received an unexpected call. It was Mark. His voice sounded strange, a mixture of awkwardness and pity. "Julian, where are you? Can we meet?" Julian hesitated for a moment, but agreed. They met in a nondescript cafe. Mark looked older, more tired. He poured him a cup of coffee and was silent for a long time before speaking. "The company is completely under Eleanor's control now. She brought in a professional management team, and honestly, it's running better than when we were in charge." Julian's hand froze over his cup. He said nothing. "I know you hate me," Mark sighed. "But when Eleanor put those documents in front of me, I had no choice. It was either the company goes under and we both go to prison, or I sacrifice you to save the firm and the 40 employees who depend on it." "I understand," Julian replied in a hoarse voice. At this point, he no longer had the right to hate anyone. "Actually, I'm here on behalf of someone else." Mark took a thick envelope from his briefcase and pushed it across the table. "Eleanor asked me to give you this." Julian froze. He thought that apart from the monthly child support payments, their lives would never cross again. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. It wasn't legal documents. It was a stack of photographs of his son. There were professional shots from his first year. The baby, dressed in a little suit, smiling with radiant joy as he crawled on a lawn. His chubby hands clutched the grass. In one particular photo, the boy was in a stroller, and Eleanor, crouching beside him, looked at him with absolute, luminous love. Every image documented the child's growth and Eleanor's happiness as a mother. At the bottom of the stack was a small card. In Eleanor's elegant handwriting, it said, "He is doing very well. I hope you can start a new life, too." Julian's tears fell onto the table. This stack of photos became the only dim light in his dark world. He cherished them, looking at them every night. The sight of his son's innocent smile seemed to ease some of the pain he carried in his chest. Eleanor's message, "I hope you can start a new life too," was a distant blessing and a final farewell. He understood that she had completely left the past behind and had begun a new chapter with her son, and that he, too, had to rise from the ruins he had created. He stopped striving for the impossible, gave up on the idea of a glorious comeback, buried the ego of the successful architect, and put his feet back on the ground. He got a job at a small renovation firm in the suburbs, starting as a draftsman's assistant. His colleagues didn't know about his past. They just saw a middle-aged man down on his luck. Every day, he drew basic floor plans, visited dusty residential sites, took measurements, and supervised electrical and plumbing installations. The work was hard, and the pay was a fraction of what he used to spend on a single dinner. But for the first time in his life, he felt a connection to reality. Every night, returning to his small apartment, he would cook something simple and then open his architecture books, relearning the fundamentals he had once scorned. He discovered that by shedding the superficial aesthetics and pretentious ideas and returning to the basics of creating safe, comfortable, and functional spaces, he had rediscovered his love for design. He stopped chasing flashy facades and started focusing on sustainable materials, the logic of spaces, whether the height of a countertop was truly comfortable for the person cooking. His designs were no longer to feed his ego. They were to serve people. 6 months later, the firm got a difficult project. A client had bought a house with a chaotic layout, full of load-bearing walls and terrible natural light. Several designers had failed to find a viable solution. The project manager was at his wits' end. Julian silently took the blueprints and studied them for 3 days. On the third day, he presented a complete redesign plan. He didn't propose demolishing the house. Instead, through the clever use of mirrors, the reorganization of non-load-bearing walls, and precise lighting design, he managed to maximize space and light. Every detail was backed by rigorous structural calculations and technical specifications. It was a solid, professional, impeccable piece of work. The client immediately approved the project. This project made him a key figure in the small firm. His boss began to entrust him with more important tasks. Gradually, his life began to stabilize. He continued to pay child support on the first of every month, but he never tried to interfere in Eleanor's life. He knew that staying away was the only right thing he could do for them. 2 years flew by. Julian was now the lead designer at the firm. He no longer sought recognition. He focused solely on his work. His designs began to gain a reputation among clients as functional, professional, and deeply human. One day, as he was working in his office, the secretary called his extension. "Mr. Vance, a Dr. David Chen is here to see you." Julian's heart stopped for a moment. He walked to the reception area and opened the door to the meeting room. There stood the man he had never forgotten. David looked the same as he had 2 years ago, distinguished, calm, serene. Seeing him, he stood up and politely extended his hand. "Julian, hello. I'm sorry to come without an appointment. I hope I'm not interrupting." Julian shook his hand stiffly, his mind filled with doubt. "Dr. Chen, what brings you here?" "It's Eleanor. She wants to see you," he replied directly. Julian looked up in surprise. Eleanor wanted to see him. "Are she and Leo all right?" he asked immediately. "They're both perfectly fine," David answered with a genuine smile. He paused before continuing. "Julian, I know you might have had the wrong impression about my role in the past, so I want to clarify that before you see her. When Eleanor found out about the affair and Leo was in the NICU, I was there to support her. But everything she did, the audit, the legal strategy, was her decision. I only offered medical help for Leo and support as a friend. She is far stronger and more independent than you ever imagined." Julian was silent. So his paranoia was nothing more than a projection of his own guilt. Because he was capable of deceit, he assumed everyone was plotting. She wants to see you today because there's an important decision that requires your consent, David added in a serious tone. Julian's chest tightened. Is it Leo? Is he sick? No, don't worry, David replied. Leo is perfectly healthy. He took a short pause. It's about something else. Eleanor and I are getting married. After the wedding, I want to give Leo a complete, unified family. I want to adopt him officially. The word adopt hit Julian like a wrecking ball. He knew the law. If he agreed to a step-parent adoption, his parental rights would be permanently terminated. Legally, he would become a complete stranger to his own son. For the adoption process to be valid, the court requires a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights from the biological father, David continued. Eleanor has already agreed. Now we need your signature. He took a thick legal document from his briefcase. Consent to adoption and termination of parental rights. Julian looked at the paper. His hands were shaking violently. He wanted to refuse, to scream, "No, that's my son. Why should I give him to another man?" But by what right could he refuse? For the past 2 years, David had been there. David had seen Leo's first steps, heard his first words. When Leo had a fever in the middle of the night, it was David who held him in the emergency room. And what had he done? Julian, the biological father, apart from cold, automatic bank transfers, what had he contributed? He didn't even have the right to hold his own son. David seemed to sense his torment. He spoke gently. Julian, I know this seems cruel, but think about Leo. He's over 2 years old now. He's starting to understand the world. Soon he'll go to preschool and ask why other kids have a daddy at home, while his daddy is just in a few photographs. He paused. I want to adopt him not to take anything from you, but to give him a complete childhood without confusion or stigma. He'll have a mother who loves him deeply and a father who will treat him as his own. He'll grow up in a home full of love. He took a deep breath before continuing. And we won't lie to him. When he's old enough, he will know the truth. He will know he has a biological father who loved him enough to make the hardest decision. And on that day, if he wants to find you, that will be his choice. David's words were sincere. There was no arrogance, no pressure. Everything revolved around the child's well-being. Compared to that, Julian's attachment seemed selfish and empty. He closed his eyes in pain. He knew David was right. A stable, loving home was essential for a child's development, and he could no longer offer that. By what right would he prevent someone else from doing so? He had already destroyed too much. He couldn't let his ego destroy his son's future as well. I need to see her, he said in a trembling voice. I want to hear it from her. David nodded in understanding. Of course. She's waiting for you in the cafe downstairs. Julian straightened his shirt collar, took a deep breath, and walked out of the room. Every step felt like walking on glass. In the cafe, Eleanor was sitting by the window. 2 years had passed, yet she seemed the same. She had a short, elegant, professional haircut and a perfectly tailored blazer. She exuded the confidence and elegance of a successful woman, but her eyes remained clear, calm. Seeing him approach, she didn't stand up, only gestured to the chair opposite her. How are you? Julian sat down, not knowing what to say. I'm doing well, Eleanor answered in a calm tone, as if speaking to a distant acquaintance. The company is thriving. Leo is wonderful. And you? Mark told me you're doing well at your new job. Surviving, Julian replied with a bitter smile. Enough to pay the rent. A short silence fell between them. David has explained everything to you, Eleanor finally said. Julian nodded, not taking his eyes off her. Is this really what you want? She met his gaze without flinching. Julian, we both have to look forward. I left the past behind a long time ago. My only priority now is to give Leo the best possible environment to grow up in. She paused. David is wonderful with him, and Leo adores him. When they're together, they are a real father and son. Julian pressed his lips together. So you want to completely erase my existence as his father? A hint of reproach crept into his voice. Eleanor slowly shook her head. A complex emotion appeared in her eyes. Compassion, but above all, determination. I'm not erasing you. I'm protecting him. Her tone was firm. I don't want him to grow up in the shadow of a broken family. I don't want him to hear comments from other parents at school. I don't want him to wonder why his daddy doesn't live with us. She looked at him intently. Julian, answer me one question. In the past 2 years, besides sending money, have you fulfilled a single fatherly duty? Each word was like a needle piercing his chest. Do you know what his favorite toy is? Do you know what foods he's allergic to? Do you know if he reaches out with his right or left hand when he falls? Julian couldn't answer because it was all true. Giving him a complete family is the only thing I can do for him now, Eleanor continued. So I'm asking you, for the last time. Her voice softened, but her decision was unshakable. Let us go. Let him go. Julian looked at her for a long time. There was no trace of the love she once had for him in her eyes, only the fierce determination of a mother. He understood he had no right to cling on. He picked up the pen David had left on the table. With a trembling hand, he signed the document relinquishing his parental rights. The moment the ink dried, he felt the last thread connecting him to this world snap. After a long silence, he pushed the document toward her. The gesture seemed to have emptied his life. He stood up, not looking at her, and turned to leave. Julian. Eleanor's voice stopped him. He froze without turning around. Thank you. Her voice was soft but firm. As compensation, the share you ceded in the company will be valued at its current market price. I will transfer the equivalent to you in cash. It's what you are owed for having built it. Julian's body tensed. He let out a bitter laugh, shook his head. Without turning, he muttered, Don't. Consider it my last gift to Leo. He pushed the glass door and walked out into the New York sun. The light was bright, but he felt no warmth. He returned to his apartment, closed the door, and didn't leave for the rest of the day. He didn't cry, he didn't get angry, he just sat in silence with an empty head. He felt like a hollow shell, floating in a void. By evening, his phone vibrated with a notification from his bank. A huge transfer had been credited to his account. Julian knew immediately that Eleanor had ignored his refusal and sent him the money corresponding to the buyout of his shares anyway. He looked at the long row of zeros and couldn't help a bitter irony. He had spent half his life fighting to achieve such wealth. And now, having lost everything that truly mattered to get it, the money had come back to him as a kind of compensation for his own life. What did he need it for now? To buy a mansion again? There would be no family in it. To start another architectural firm? He no longer had the ambition or the ego for that. The next day, Julian made a decision. He submitted his resignation to the renovation firm. Then he used the money to buy a modest one-story house with a large plot of land in the rural Hudson Valley. He didn't go back to architecture. Instead, he dedicated himself entirely to farming and landscape design. He gave all his time to that piece of land, digging the soil, planting seeds, watering, fertilizing. He cared for each plant with the same attention someone would care for a child. He grew accustomed to the silence of nature and found a rhythm in this tranquility, watching a seed sprout, a seedling reach for the sun. His mind, previously restless and turbulent, began to find peace. He stopped reading financial news, stopped following the industry, and cut all ties with his previous life. He lived like a modern-day hermit. He hid the box with Leo's photos and the copy of the document where he had relinquished his parental rights and locked it in a drawer. He told himself that this chapter of his life was completely closed. What he didn't know was that while he was finding peace on his land, Eleanor was fulfilling her own promises. Eleanor did not rush to marry David. After getting Julian's signature, she used the exact money he had refused to establish a nonprofit organization. She called it the Phoenix Initiative. As executive director, Eleanor used her financial expertise and network of contacts to help women who had suffered from economic abuse or betrayal in their marriages. She offered them legal support, taught them how to track hidden assets, provided mental health resources, and helped them regain their economic independence. Her story caught the attention of a major media outlet. The report resonated with the public. Thousands of people were touched by her strength, her intelligence, her compassion. The Phoenix Initiative began to receive large donations, helping thousands of women across the country. Eleanor became a symbol of empowerment. She was no longer someone's wife or someone's mother. She was simply Eleanor independent, strong, brilliant. Julian knew nothing about this. He had completely isolated himself from the world, until one day, a year later, while buying rose fertilizer at a nursery, something caught his eye. On the magazine rack, he saw a cover. It was a major magazine, and on the cover was Eleanor, standing in front of her foundation's headquarters, smiling with impressive confidence. Beside her, slightly behind, was Dr. David Chen looking at her with pride, holding the hand of a little boy Leo. The three of them were a perfect picture of harmony. The headline read, "From Betrayal to Strength, How Eleanor Vance Turned Her Darkest Hour into Hope for Thousands." Julian stood motionless for a long time, then picked up the magazine and began to read the interview. He read about the foundation, about the women who had been helped, about her philosophy of independence and recovery. One sentence stood out among all the others. "I don't hate him. In a way, I'm grateful to him. He taught me a harsh lesson. A woman's security should not depend on a marriage or a man. It must be born from her own ability and inner strength." Julian smiled a genuine, relieved smile. He was happy for her. Eleanor hadn't gotten stuck in the pain. She had transformed her experience into something that protected others. She had become someone remarkable. And seeing her like this, he felt he could finally let go. Letting go is easy to say, but healing takes years. Julian closed the magazine and put it back on the shelf. He didn't buy it. He no longer needed to look into other people's lives to find meaning in his own. He returned to his country house. It was a perfect spring day. The climbing roses were in full bloom, and the bees were buzzing quietly in the warm air. He put on his work apron, took his pruning shears, and began to trim the branches. The days flowed by, calm and measured. Through his work, he got to know some neighbors who shared his love for the land. Sometimes they would sit on the porch, drink beer, and talk about the weather or the quality of the soil. No one knew his past. To them, he was just a quiet man with a special talent for gardening. Sometimes, in the early morning, he would open the drawer and look at the photos. His son must have grown by now. In his imagination, he was no longer a baby. His face was getting thinner, his body changing. He wondered if he liked soccer or hockey, if he was having trouble in school, but he never tried to find out. He knew he had lost that right. This silent longing was his punishment and, at the same time, the only connection he had left with his lost love. 10 years passed. Julian was now 50. The sun and physical labor had left their mark on his face, and his hair had turned completely gray, but his eyes were clearer and calmer. His small landscape design business had become well known in the region. His hybrid roses were prized in local gardening circles. He never remarried. He lived quietly, alone, in the company of plants and the changing seasons. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, he was in the front garden, watering some newly planted hydrangeas. Suddenly, the bell on his gate rang. He looked up, surprised. He rarely had visitors at this time. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked to the entrance. Opening the gate, he saw a boy of about 12 or 13. He was wearing a simple, well-ironed shirt and a canvas backpack. His features were unmistakable. He looked like Julian, but his presence was completely different. His eyes were bright, confident, and reflected the calm and assurance of someone who had grown up in a home full of love. Julian recognized him instantly, though he had only seen him as a baby in photographs. His heart began to pound in his chest. His hands tightened on the garden hose, and he couldn't help it. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Julian Vance?" the boy asked. His voice was clear, though with a slight nervous tremor. Julian opened his mouth, but his throat was tight. He couldn't make a sound, only nodded firmly. "I'm Leo. Leo Chen. Well, legally Leo Chen, but I know I was born Leo Vance." The boy looked him straight in the eye with an open and calm expression. "My mom is Eleanor." A powerful stinging filled Julian's eyes. He wanted to say 1,000 things, but couldn't. "Can I come in and sit for a minute?" Leo asked, pointing to the flowering garden behind him. "Yes, of course, please, come in," Julian managed to say, quickly stepping aside. Leo walked into the garden and looked around with genuine admiration. He stopped in front of a rose bush of a deep purple hue. "Wow, these are incredible. It's a rhapsody in blue. My dad says they're hard to care for." Julian was surprised. "You know about roses?" "My dad loves gardening. I help him sometimes," Leo replied with a smile. The dad he was talking about was, of course, Dr. David Chen. A slight pang of pain shot through Julian's chest, but it was quickly replaced by a strange feeling of gratitude. They sat on the wicker chairs on the porch. Julian poured him a glass of homemade iced tea. "How did you find me?" he finally asked. "My mom gave me the address," Leo replied, taking a sip. "Actually, I know about you. My parents never hid anything from me. They told me the whole story when I was old enough to understand. They showed me your pictures." He took a short pause. "I came today on my own. I just wanted to meet my biological father in person." He spoke with surprising maturity. There was no anger, no resentment. Julian looked at the young man before him, healthy, intelligent, well-mannered, and full of kindness. In that moment, the last trace of bitterness left in his heart vanished. He understood with absolute clarity that Eleanor and David had given this boy a life he could never have offered. Signing those papers 10 years ago was the best decision of his life. "Do you hate me?" Julian asked in a trembling voice. Leo shook his head. "Mom explained to me that relationships between adults are complicated, that not everything is black and white. She said you made a very serious mistake, but that people can make mistakes. The important thing is to learn." He looked at him with a calm expression. "She also told me to never let resentment define who I am." He paused before continuing. "And she asked me to tell you something. She says she hopes you are well, and that knowing you've found a peaceful life makes her happy." Julian couldn't hold back any longer. Tears streamed down his face, tracing the wrinkles left by the years. All this time, Eleanor had known about him not to spy, not to humiliate, but simply to hope that he would one day find peace. She didn't want to erase him from the world. She just wanted him to heal. He tried to speak, choking on his tears. He wanted to say sorry, but he knew those words weren't enough. Leo opened his backpack and took out a small, worn velvet box. He handed it to him. "Mom said I should give this to you. She said it's something you never wanted to take back." With trembling hands, Julian opened it. Inside was a vintage Omega watch. It was the watch Eleanor had given him many years ago, with her first big bonus when she worked as an auditor. He had worn it for a while, until money and ego had made him replace it with a showy Rolex. He never knew she had kept it all this time. On the back, engraved in the steel, were the words, "May your life be reliable and calm." Julian held the watch and felt like he was holding the entire first half of his life in his hands. He finally broke. He covered his face with his hands and cried like a child, a deep cry like someone who has been lost for many years and has finally found their way. Leo said nothing. He just sat beside him, silently accompanying him. After a while, he got up, adjusted a pot that the wind had moved, and neatly swept away some soil. They spent the whole evening on that porch. Father and son talked for hours about plants, about school, about the future. Julian shared the lessons he had learned, hiding nothing. He hoped his mistakes would serve as a warning on Leo's path. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and purple tones, Leo stood up. "Can I come back sometime?" he asked, adjusting his backpack. Julian nodded excitedly, smiling through his tears. "Yes, whenever you want. This door will always be open." Watching the boy walk away down the gravel path, Julian felt a deep peace like never before. He knew his life had been marked by a great mistake, but he had finally learned to forgive himself and accept the past. He looked at the Omega watch on his wrist and put it on. It fit perfectly. The evening breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of blooming roses. He had lost everything his ego had built, but somehow, at the end of the road, he had found the most important thing. Not wealth, not fame, but a quiet redemption born from love and forgiveness.